In 2009, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund staff held a meeting to discuss the history of the organization. Here is John Zippert, the Director of Programs for the Federation.
Sweet potato and vegetable co-op it was located in a place called Sunset, Louisiana, St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. Southern Consumers Cooperative, and Carol will speak to that, I'm sure. And the Freedom Quilting Bee was there, several credit unions in Alabama, the Mileston Farmers Co-op from Mississippi. They had a cotton gin that was operating at the time, and a feed and seed store in Holmes County, Mississippi. There was a craft cooperative connected with Jesse Morris. Freedom House, it operated, it had several branches in Mississippi of people making handicraft items. Who was there from Georgia? West Georgia Farmers Co-op was CCC, yes, Civilian Conservation Corps. It was a Roosevelt, FDR.
Group over where one of our board members from there, and Alice got the whole story on. Some of our groups actually came out of that era.
Well, in that sense, the Freedom Quilting Bee
as well
was the land in Gee's Bend was one of these resettlement communities. Mileston Cooperative was one, and this is where during the New Deal in the beginning of the Roosevelt administration, the government bought plantations or took over plantations where people went broke in the Depression, and they took in Gee's Bend, it was about 10,000 acres. So that was roughly what it was in all of the places, and they redivided it into 40 and 80 acre farms. Now also at this meeting was a group from Hilton Head, South Carolina, Hilton Head Shrimp Co-op, and we had a co-op also, Bluffton Oyster Co-op. So we've been working with seafood for a long time, Stephanie. And there were some, Mr. Twitty was there representing a farmers co-op, Heath Springs
potato co-ops.
Farmers co-op in South Carolina. It was a credit union in South Carolina.
Fishing cooperatives, because that was most of the work that black people were doing, and we started, but they were doing it on boats owned by other folk, and they started the fishing cooperative. A guy named Tom Bunwell, which was our staff person at that time, was our field staff person over there. And actually, Captain Dave, I remember him very well. I remember one time we had our staff retreat over there and went out on a fishing boat there back in those days, but they actually owned their boats and really went out and fished, and we sold the same thing, and we owned all that land, and all of it was at that time right on the waterfront with docks and so forth. Now we can't even pay to walk on it, the same land. We can't even go there. So it was some rich history across the whole region, even coming out of Texas there. What was the group there named, John, with the handicraft group? Carol, you remember? Miss La Rosa, Robstown Co-op.
Some of these we mentioned go beyond the original 22, but there were 22 that met in early '67. Most of them were organized by people who had been involved in some way or other in the civil rights movement. Many of the ones in Louisiana were influenced by the Congress of Racial Equality. Some of those in Mississippi and Alabama, people who were involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Also SCLC. You heard Albert Turner's name mentioned in conjunction with Swafka. And last night some of us saw a film that has Albert Turner in it. And he was the SCLC state director in Alabama before he began working with co-ops. So we had a variety of people who came out of civil rights organizing, and Wendell didn't specifically say, but he was a SNCC field worker before he began working with the Federation as part of his history, and I think it's important to say that. And Shirley Sherrod on our staff, Charles Sherrod, her husband, if you've seen the civil rights documentary, Eyes on the Prize, if you've seen Eyes on the Prize, and if you haven't, you should see it. It's Charles Sherrod was the leader of the movement in Albany, Georgia. And so the people who were involved in starting the Federation came out of that organizing and that background and that kind of effort. So there were meetings in 1967 which led to the formation of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. I want to mention one other meeting and then talk a little about how we got here, because I think how we got here and why we're here, and I know Wendell spoke a little about it earlier, but to give some more of that history to you as well. But there was a meeting held in 1966 at a place called Mount Beulah, which was outside of Bolton, Mississippi. I don't know if the Mount Beulah Center still exists. We often met there, and civil rights and social change groups and social justice groups met there. And that's how we came actually to first meet Benny Thompson, because we used to go to Mount Beulah, and Mount Beulah was in Bolton, and we met him because that was his hometown. In 1966 at Mount Beulah was a meeting that was put together by some people from the Southern Regional Council, which was a group in Atlanta. Anyway, the Southern Regional Council was active throughout the Southeast in working with people who were involved in human relations and social justice type concerns. And one of the people they had working for them was a person whose name was Al Ulmer. Wendell mentioned him. But Southern Regional Council had sent him around to visit some of these cooperatives. And so this meeting was convened in part by Southern Regional Council, in part by Southern Consumers Co-op that Father McKnight, you heard his name, was instrumental in. The Cooperative League of the USA, which is the name that the National Co-op Business Association used to have, Cooperative League of the USA, CLUSA. They were a Washington-based, a national group interested in co-ops. They knew about Father McKnight. They knew a little about some of these activities, and they also were sponsoring this meeting. And then a group that Wendell mentioned briefly, the American Friends Service Committee, which is the Quakers from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Those groups helped to convene this meeting at Mount Beulah. And there were some of the co-ops that I mentioned, some of the 22 co-ops attended this meeting. And the discussion there, and you know, we have a dinner from Miss Witherspoon. Miss Witherspoon was at this meeting from the Freedom Quilting Bee. Lewis Black, Mildred Black, I think Howard Bailey from Milestone Co-op, some of us from Alabama, we met there, the people from that oil co-op in Tennessee. We talked about how we could work together. At this meeting, we said we really ought to form some kind of organization to work together to promote co-ops, and we ought to write a proposal for the Ford Foundation. This is one of the first proposals that I ever participated in writing. I was on the committee with Al Ulmer and some other people to help write this proposal. And part of the idea was that out of this should come some federation of the co-ops. Now, as you know, the Ford Foundation takes a long time to decide about proposals. So while this proposal process was going on, the co-op said, we want to go forward. From the 66 meeting came the 67 meeting in Atlanta at ITC, and that meeting had an organizing committee that led to the federation. Ultimately, the Ford proposal was funded, and it was funded through something called the Southern Consumers Education Foundation, which Father McKnight had set up. And the people in Louisiana, they had Southern Consumers Cooperative, and they had Southern Consumers Education Foundation. And so the Ford money came to that, and they established something called the Southern Cooperative Development Program. And so after 2 years of being a volunteer with the Congress of Racial Equality, from 65 to 67, I got hired to work with Father McKnight in Louisiana to work on this Southern Cooperative Development Program, which was to be a precursor to the Federation. At the same time, the co-op people who met in Atlanta went forward to form the Federation. And the Cooperative League of the USA said, we have $35,000 to support an executive director for this new federation. And they initially hired a person who was an extension agent from somewhere in Alabama. And this gentleman, he quit, Ralph. He refused. They appointed him for the job, and before he could take the job, he quit. He got scared. He couldn't quite see how $35,000 was going to be a federation over the whole Southeast. And Charles Prejean, who was the chair of the board, he represented Southern Consumers Cooperative on this original board of the Federation. They prevailed upon Charles to move his family to Atlanta in 1967 and start the Federation of Southern Cooperatives with $35,000. And he went and he got started. There was an office on Fairley Street in Atlanta, an office about as big as your office, Pam. And Charles started there. Soon after that, the Federation was funded by the Office of Economic Opportunity and the Ford Foundation, and other staff were hired. That's when Ralph was hired, and other people to start the Federation. So one of the dreams, one of the goals we had at that time was to have a training center. We said we want to place a training center of our own where we can train people in what cooperatives are about, train people in agricultural skills, handicraft, manufacturing, some of the things that people were involved in. We were looking for a place to have this training center. We tried to buy Mount Bayou, Mississippi. We tried to buy a junior college in Okolona, Mississippi. Those things didn't work out. Meanwhile, there was a group of people here in Sumter County who had been living on plantations, and Wendell talked a little bit about this earlier. These people were living on plantations north of where we are now in Sumter County. Now we're going back now to 1966. They filed a lawsuit in 1966 against the plantation owners because the plantation owners were receiving a check from the government to reduce their acreage, their allotment of cotton. So in other words, if you were planting 100 acres of cotton, they said, well, this year you should only plant 80, and we will pay you based on your yield and your record. We will pay you for the 20 acres that we don't want you to plant. And so the plantation owners received a check from the government for this reduction of the acreage. And part of the deal was that this money was supposed to be shared with the tenant farmers on the land in accordance with their tenancy. So if you were a tenant on halves, then you were supposed to get half of the money. If you were a 2/3 tenant and the owner was 1/3, you were supposed to get 2/3 of the money. And the plantation owners took all of the money, didn't give any of the money to the tenant farmers. So these farmers here in Sumter County, they sued the plantation owners, one of which was Mr. Rogers and Mr. Parker, and there were some others. Now, the interesting thing about Mr. Rogers was that he was also the chairperson of the Sumter County ASCS Committee, Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. So when Mr. Rogers got into the trial, he didn't have any excuse for why he didn't give the tenants their fair share of the payment, because he was the person who was supposed to know all the rules. He was the chair of the committee that made the rules. So, and we still are dealing with these committees and these committee people. Changed the name, it's the FSA committee today, but that committee's origin is in this ASCS committee. And so the 100 families on these 3 plantations, they won their lawsuit, and they were all supposed to get some money. Now, some people got a little bit of money, but other people, the plantation owner said, well, the record shows that you borrowed so-and-so much, you got furnished so-and-so much, so I don't really owe you this money. You owe me money, I owe you money, and no more money for you. So even after winning the suit, people got beat again by a pencil. Beyond that, the plantation owners were so mad about the lawsuit that they said, we're going to evict everybody. We're going to stop planting cotton. We're going to raise pine trees and beef cattle. We're not going to plant cotton anymore on these plantations. And so they evicted 100 families. We have some records. Some of the families went to Chicago. A small number went to Tuskegee. 40 families stayed in Sumter County, and they formed the Panola Land Buying Association. So here we now have 40 families who are the Panola land buyers. There were no direct martyrs of the cooperative movement, but I think the economic exploitation was suffering enough for a lot of the people. So here we had 40 families that were the Panola land buyers. They were contacted by some organizers, Mr. Albert Turner. All of these people are now deceased. Albert Turner, Lewis Black, and Thelma Craig, and to some extent Mrs. Mildred Black, Lewis Black's wife. And they began working with the Panola land buyers. And they found this merchant in Gainesville, Alabama, Mr. P.M. Norwood, who had lost 3 tracts of land in a foreclosure. Wendell mentioned this, to 3 different sort of white people in the area. And so the Panola land buyers entered into an agreement with Mr. Norwood that they would help him to redeem all 3 tracts of land, and 2 of the tracts would come to the Panola land buyers, and 1 he would keep. And the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, with money from the Ford Foundation, put up $15,000 of option money, earnest money, was put in the bank for Mr. Norwood, pending the outcome of this redemption. And we did go into the local circuit court. Now we're talking 1967, 66, 67, 68. Every time we went to a hearing on the case, one of the 3 people who owned the land didn't show up, or one of the lawyers couldn't come. And this was in front of a judge whose name was Judge Hildred. And once we began the redemption, as long as we began the redemption process within the 2 years, it was a valid effort. But the local people were trying to defeat this by just never having the hearing. And Judge Hildred, who had loaned money to all of these people over the years, he knew exactly who the Panola land buyers were. He knew who Lewis Black was. He knew who Albert Turner was. And he was not ever going to give this land to them. He was never going to allow them to use their redemption rights. And he kept postponing and postponing. So the lawyer we had for this was Oscar Adams from Birmingham, a black lawyer who subsequently became the first black member of the Alabama Supreme Court. And he came to our annual meeting when he was on the Supreme Court and told some of this story in his speech at the annual meeting. So Oscar Adams said, well, what are we going to do? Anyway, Oscar Adams, after trying for 2 years, he said, we're going to remove this to federal court. And he used, of course, the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments, saying that black people were not getting justice in the state court. But he also used the fact, and Wendell mentioned that since the American Friends Service Committee was a Pennsylvania corporation, that we were dealing with a matter here in interstate commerce. And I bring that up to say sometimes it's good to know what it says in the Constitution, because you can use it sometime. And he used it, and we got into federal court. When we got to federal court, this is when these 3 owners showed up with these documents saying that they had made all these improvements to the land. So they said, we can't let you redeem this for the redemption price because we've made all these improvements. One of the improvements they made was to cut timber at the stump, sold the timber, and claimed they had cleared so and so many acres of the land and they should be paid a higher price for clearing the land, so say. I give these details again because this is the business that we are in. We understand what this was about. Anyway, in September of 1970, so we're looking after a 3-year legal struggle the Panola Land Buying Association came into possession of this land for $187 an acre for 1,164 acres of land. At this point, Mr. Norwood had gotten a divorce and different other things. He took the $15,000 and said, you can have the land, all of it. So the original price was about half of the $187. And this land is still on the Federation's financial statement, right, Ralph? At the $187 an acre, because that's the way we have to do our accounting, which is why sometime when you look at the financial statement of the Federation, it doesn't reflect the true value of our assets. And that's been, we have that as a problem too. But anyway, the judge ruled that we could purchase the land, 1,164 acres of land, for $187 an acre. Now, Father McKnight and I have been sitting around trying to figure out, we knew that day was coming. How are we going to finance this land? And we came up with the first mortgage holder was something called the League Life Insurance Company. It was a credit union insurance company. And yes, the interest was 10%, but we couldn't get a loan anywhere else. Joseph Hansknecht. So we got the League Life Insurance Company had the first mortgage. By that time, and this is a whole nother story, we had helped Father McKnight to start something called the Southern Cooperative Development Fund, which was to be a bank for our cooperatives. And that bank came up with the second mortgage and a third mortgage of $25,000 each. The League Life people came up with about $120,000. And then we got the last little bit of it from a guy whose name was Dick Russell. And Russell was a car dealer somewhere in Florida. And I don't know if Father McKnight found him somewhere one day. It was somebody, called Father McKnight and said, I want to help poor people. And Father said, I got just the thing for you. I got this deal for you. You can have the fourth mortgage on this land. Now, I want you to know, eventually all of these people were paid. So we had the money to buy the land. After we bought the land, we asked Wendell Paris to come here and start working with the Panola land buyers. And shortly after that, we had a meeting of the Federation and the Panola land buyers. And we said to the Panola land buyers, look, you've got this land now. The Federation is looking for a place. You remember, we were looking for a place to have a training center in the South, centrally located. We said, look, we've helped you to get this land. We want you to take a part of the land and let us develop a co-op training center on it. And the Panola land buyers agreed, and we actually removed 40 acres, the 40 acres that are on all the buildings, and we removed that from these mortgages. And the Federation got the title initially to 40 acres of land. Over the process of paying for the land, the Federation assumed all of that and paid all of that. And ultimately, we reached some other discussions with the Panola land buyers on dividing the land between us and them over the course of time. But that's how the Federation got to be on this land through all of these struggles in Epes, Alabama.